Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of News from a World in Flux. Regular viewers of our show will notice a couple of interesting changes this time. We're not in any of our normal studios, we're in Windsor, and you can see this famous Windsor castle behind me. Unfortunately, one thing that does mean is that we're under the flight path of Heathrow Airport, and the planes are just crazy. I don't know how people in Windsor manage to live here, but if we do have a bit of noise while we're chatting, I can only apologise for that. I'm also not with Claire. I'm with Marijn Van De Geer. Marijn is a key member of Extinction Rebellion's Citizens Assembly Working Group, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to have a special episode just talking about deliberative democracy. So welcome, Marijn.
Thanks, Charlie.
What's going on here? What can you tell us about what we can see?
I know, so this is really exciting. What we're seeing here behind us is the mass assembly. So it's literally a mass assembly. It's a giant community assembly that we're setting up here as part of Upgrade Democracy, which is a 3-day, what I've been calling a democracy boot camp, really, here in Windsor, where we're talking about the current political system, why it isn't working, why it's unfit to deal with issues like the climate and ecological breakdown, and what it could look like instead. So it's a weekend of reimagining the future, reimagining the political system. And so, behind us we see people, hundreds of people, deliberating on how we might upgrade democracy.
So why do we need to do that? What's the problem here?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because lots of people tell us, you know, we have a democracy, we fought so hard to have the right to vote, for women to have the right to vote. Lots of countries don't have democracy at all, and that's all true up to a certain extent. But what we have is electoral politics. And actually, democracy really is something that is about people being involved and engaged with decision-making, decisions that involve their lives and have an impact on their lives. And that's not what we're seeing in this current political system. Decisions are being made by politicians who are very out of touch with the reality on the ground, people's daily lives, needs, concerns. And what we're seeing, especially again when we're talking about climate and the environment, decisions are being made that are influenced with people who are actually actively trying to stop action on climate and ecological breakdown. So that's why we think we need to look beyond electoral politics and representative democracy that we currently have now and enhance it, make it better, make it more fit for purpose.
It's an interesting time to be doing this, I think, because of course we've just had the general election.
Yeah.
And I think, as you say, lots of people perhaps see that as democracy in action. It goes to show that we do have a system that is fit for allowing people to choose between different options. But of course, there isn't really any choice, is there? Because we're approaching. Are we approaching 50 days? I think since the Labour Party have been in government, and already we're seeing very strong signs that they are just going to be, to a large extent, continuing with Tory policies, both with the really slow pace of decarbonisation, but also with the criminalisation of protest too. So we really haven't seen much choice in what was presented to us by the mainstream parties, and I think lots of people, not just environmentalists, not just climate campaigners, but lots of people in this country do seem to be really fed up with the lack of choice and with not feeling represented by our current political system. Do you think that's fair? I mean, we had really low turnout, for example, didn't we?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think this last election is just such a pivotal time. The turnout was very low. Both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party had the lowest count of votes they've ever had, I think, since 1918. You're seeing people voting more towards reform. Green Party had some massive gains, but there's just been a YouGov poll commissioned by the Sortition Foundation that found that a huge percentage, I think something like 72% of the people who took that poll said they do not trust politics and they do not trust politicians. So there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot to unpack there, I think. So there's what we in the Citizens Assembly Working Group say is that there's kind of 4 pillars of problems with the current political system. Yeah, and so they are short-term thinking, opposition, lobbying and vested interest, and not truly representative. So basically what that means is that currently the political system functions in political cycles. So we're thinking sort of 4 to 5 years, whenever the next elections are. And that is really the main focus of political parties, because obviously the main aim for them is to stay in power. So they don't want to rock the boat too much. They don't want to take huge, controversial, difficult decisions, and they want to think in those 4-5 year cycles. And
that's a particular problem when we're in a planetary emergency that is going to require us as a society to limit our material consumption, and particularly the wealthiest in our society are going to have to limit their consumption. And of course there's no way to do that without policies that might be unpopular amongst some sections of the public. So this is the fear, isn't it? It's that you can't take difficult decisions when you're focused on getting re-elected next year.
Exactly. These policies are going to be rolled out. They'll need to be rolled out for the next 10, 20, 50, whatever years. It's long-term policies that we need to think about. So that's really the first problem, is that short-term thinking that just doesn't allow that long-term planning that is needed with, for example, the climate and ecological emergency.
Just if I could just add on that, I think another thing that really contributes to that is the distant targets we have, right? So, when the government has a decarbonisation target of 2050, but doesn't have a decarbonisation target which is relevant in 5 years, then it's very easy to think, well, I can just leave that to my successor. Whoever's going to come next can deal with that problem, which is why it's so important that we need interim targets, 1 year, 2 year, 5 year targets all the time, because otherwise you can just leave it. And we've seen this nonsense in all sorts of ways. So remember the coal mine in Cumbria. We were told that was compatible with our net zero obligations because it would cease producing coal in 2049, which is just nonsense. So this inability of our political system to take on the long-term challenge that we need is a real problem.
Yeah, exactly. So the next one is vested interests or lobbying. So politics is totally linked and intertwined with economic interests, and especially the fossil fuel industry. There's all these deals going on behind closed doors. I can't remember quite the statistics, but the amount of meetings the Conservative government had with the fossil fuel industry compared to any other industry was huge. They were the people they met with the most from the private sector. That is, of course, totally unacceptable because the interests are totally skewed. There's lots of donations coming from the fossil fuel industry into politics as well, to the various political parties. There's Tufton Street, which we all know are funded by fossil fuel industries, which advise policy to the government.
So when you say Tufton Street, you mean all the think tanks like the Global Warming Policy Foundation, Institute for Economic Affairs, Policy Exchange, and all of them?
Yeah, exactly. That bunch. Yeah, Tufton Street, what they call the most dangerous street in the UK, basically. So they have so much vested interest there as well. They're obviously trying to influence the government to ensure that their operations can continue to go ahead as they are.
And of course we would expect that. The fossil fuel industry is one of the most valuable industries in the world, untold trillions of pounds of capital in that. And taking serious climate action basically means their business has to stop. And of course, they're going to fight to defend their future as an industry. They're going to fight that tooth and nail, and they have done so in extraordinarily filthy and dirty ways, using their financial might to essentially corrupt our political system.
And the problem is with the way that the political system currently is set up is that it just enables them to influence that system. The fact that political parties rely on donations, the fact that it is so easy to buy your way into the favour of politicians is a fundamental flaw in the system.
And it's a power that nobody else here has. Ordinary citizens of this country do not have that access to politicians that corporate lobbyists do.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us very nicely into the next pillar, which is that the current political system is not truly representative. Of course, it's slightly better now that we have a conservative, a Labour government now. I think the representation of ordinary, everyday people is slightly better than it was with the Conservatives. But this representation, the revolving door of the oil and corporate sector into politics is unreal. So many people in politics, especially in the Conservative Party, have had quite prominent roles in the fossil fuel industry and in various other corporate sectors that are tied in to climate wrecking and environment wrecking industries, who've then moved into politics and are bringing those interests with them into Westminster. And so the other thing to say about representation is that, we often don't recognize ourselves in the people who are there to represent us in government. Although with Labour, many of the prominent Labour figures are often from humble beginnings, so there is a lot to that, but they have along the way, they're career politicians, they have along the way come to a different stage in their lives where they are perhaps not that connected to that anymore, and they have that pressure of the lobbyists, of the vested interests, and of course the party whip as well. So in the UK, there is the party whip system, which tells MPs how to vote and how to respond to certain bills or proposals that are coming forward. And so even if you were a politician that was saying, okay, we have to take radical action, we have to ban oil drilling in the North Sea, you as an individual politician just wouldn't necessarily have the power to push that through, because you have to toe the party line.
You have the tide, yeah.
Yeah.
I was quite interested in what you said about people not feeling represented, because this strikes me as a really dangerous situation. It's because I think it does two things. It makes people lose faith in their governance system, and it's really important that that those in charge are legitimate in the eyes of the people that they're responsible for. There's, I think, society depends on a rule of law, and if we're to feel that the legal systems we live within are legitimate, we need to feel that our governments are legitimate. And when we don't see, when people don't see themselves represented within government, I think it diminishes that. But the other thing it does, I think it limits participation. It's so we've seen this long-term decline in numbers of people voting, for example, and when people start to disengage, start to vote less, that reduces the legitimacy of the system even further. And so it's a downward spiral with less participation, less legitimacy, and a less trusting relationship between the people and those that govern them. It does strike me as really dangerous when people don't see themselves reflected in government.
Absolutely. So representation is a huge problem. And the irony is that the current system that we have is called representative democracy. But it just simply doesn't add up. It is not. They are not the people who understand the needs and concerns and fears of the average Brit on the street. So that's a massive problem. And then finally, the fourth pillar is opposition. So what we see is, especially in the UK, because we have first past the post rather than proportional representation, so we're pretty much a two-party country. And they, never the two shall meet. They sit on opposite sides of the room. They shout at each other. It's a debate. There's no collaboration there. And I think that is something else that I think people see and just think, well, it's horrible to watch the House of Parliament, the House of Commons on TV, because it's so aggressive. And what we really need, especially in a crisis like we are now with climate and environment, we need to be collaborating. It needs to be cross-party. We need to all be pulling into the same direction. And that is just not what we're seeing in this current system, which is completely based on opposition. The party that isn't the governing party is literally called the opposition party, and it just doesn't work.
It's, apart from anything, it's not a very nice way of doing things to model for the rest of society, is it? Just reaching consensus through argument and attrition and battling against each other rather than working together to come up with the best decisions. Yeah. Which brings us quite nicely onto citizens' assemblies. So let's clear up terminology first, because we hear things like we hear about different types of assemblies. So there's citizens' assemblies and people's assemblies and community assemblies. But
now a mass assembly.
And now a mass assembly. But we also hear other kinds of terms, more descriptive terms like deliberative democracy, participatory democracy. Can you help us fit all these terms together?
Yeah, definitely. So deliberative democracy or participative democracy, they're kind of interchangeable almost. That's kind of the umbrella term. So in the same way that we have electoral politics or representative democracy now, you have deliberative democracy, but then you also have, for example, direct democracy, which is like a referendum. So deliberative democracy is this umbrella term for citizens' assemblies, citizens' forums, community assemblies, people's assemblies. They all sit in deliberative democracy. And what that means is that recommendations or solutions are found through the process of deliberation. And that's the thing that all these different processes have in common, is that you sit in groups, you exchange points of view, you have active listening. So unlike what we're seeing in Westminster, there's a lot of listening involved. And then with a facilitator, the group deliberates together on what the way forwards should be. So it's very much around collaboration. You are tasked with resolving something, and as a group, you do it together. So that is, in a nutshell, broadly what deliberative democracy is. And then all the various assemblies are kind of different levels of deliberative democracy. So what you're seeing here behind us is essentially a giant community assembly. And community assemblies are fairly simple. They can just be an hour or an afternoon or a day, fairly short. And it's self-selected. So anyone who wants to come can sign themselves up to come, and they come. So anyone passing along here on the long walk could technically come and sit down, join a group and take part in this thing. Whereas a citizens' assembly, as per XR's third demand, a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice, is a much more robust and complex process. So we have a random selection process, which is called sortition, which I always think is a little bit like the Harry Potter sorting hat. You know, you can kind of imagine things being sorted. So where a random group of people is selected, often from a database like the postcode database or something like that. And then people are invited and they respond to say, yes, I'm willing to come. No, I'm not. Everyone who wants to come is then sorted into a sample that is representative of the UK as a whole.
So it'd be 50% men, 50% women, and so economically sorted, so only a small number of very wealthy people. And
exactly, so the 1% would just be represented by 1%. If you have 100 people, it would just be one person probably. So yeah, it would just be much more fair and much more true to the population as a whole in the UK. So what we're seeing here behind us are, although there's huge value in this as well, because we need much more listening and learning from each other. But this will be, people are already concerned about climate, people are already thinking along the same lines. So this would be very different from a citizens' assembly, where if you were to run it on climate change, for example, which they did a few years ago, you could actually pick people who are maybe even climate change deniers, or they don't care about it that much, and you can have them in that group represented to be part of this conversation.
And that's a really important point to stress.
Yeah.
You know, Extinction Rebellion is calling for this to be implemented, but of course Extinction Rebellion won't be in the assembly.
No.
One Extinction Rebellion member might randomly be selected to be in there, but it won't be us.
Yeah, and I think that's quite sad in a way for people who campaign about, you know, this Citizens' Assembly on Climate and Ecological Justice. It's very likely that I will never be part of it and I'll never see it happen. So that's quite frustrating, but, you know, but that is the beauty of it. It's not run by Extinction Rebellion. And it's also to say citizens' assemblies are not an invention of Extinction Rebellion. This kind of process has been around for centuries. So people talk often about the Greeks that used a form of sortition as well, although if you were a woman or a slave, you were not part of that. But, you know, so the concept was kind of there. And loads of other cultures have already been using some form of deliberative democracy with you know, ordinary citizens involved in Latin America, in Asia, in the Middle East. These systems have existed for centuries, so it's definitely not a new thing. It's just that we haven't been using it because obviously for the group in power, they feel like it would take away from their power and therefore they don't want to use it.
But as we mentioned before, yeah, I suppose it's natural that people would be concerned about, but in fact, it can be an empowering tool for those in power because it allows them to do what needs to be done without having to suffer the consequences of being the people that implemented the unpopular decisions. They can say, it wasn't, you know,
this is the will of the people.
Yes, there has been a frequent flyer tax, you know, come into law or whatever, but it wasn't us that did it. It was the people of this country, and it's like a get out of jail free card for making difficult decisions.
Exactly. That is really something that, as a working group, when we speak to MPs about citizens' assemblies, that is something that we really stress. Like, this isn't something that's meant to take your job away or make you redundant or whatever. This is something that will actually help you. And interestingly enough, in Ireland several years ago, the issue of, for example, abortion and same-sex marriage were two subjects that were so toxic to talk about. Everyone was opinionated on it. It was hugely divided.
Whatever you say, you're going to piss off 50% of the country.
Exactly. So the politicians were just like, we do not know how to handle this. We can't deal with it. So so they decided to engage a citizens' assembly. So they had one on abortion law. They had one on same-sex marriage. And in the end, they could use that, this truly representative sample of Irish society that deliberated on it, had all this evidence come in, you know, stakeholders and rights holders would come in and present and they would deliberate on that, and they came out with a recommendation. And the politicians could then say, well, the people have spoken and this is how it is in Ireland. It then informed the information they gave out to the general public to inform the referendum. And you could actually see that the outcome of the referendum was almost exactly the same as the outcome of the assembly itself. So that's actually also a nice example, which I use all the time, that a citizens' assembly really is representative of the population as a whole. The percentages of the votes were almost identical.
So you scale up from 100 people to the whole population and the proportions are just the same.
If you've done the sortition process properly, which we're very lucky that we have organisations in the UK who are expert at the sortition process, if you do it properly, then you have that proper representation, it will match up. Yeah.
So I was interested in what you said before, that when you're speaking to MPs, you're keen to stress that citizens' assemblies are not replacing MPs. What would be the relationship between them? How would the Assembly advise government, and what would be the government's obligations with regards to what the Assembly decides?
So this is actually a really exciting area where, which is very new and which a lot of countries are grappling with. So as the Citizens Assembly Working Group, we have a huge network of different people organizing assemblies, and a lot of work is going on that. And at first, really, the work of the Assembly would kind of start at the commissioning of the Assembly, and then, you know, the Assembly would get organized and it would be run, and then the report would come out, and that would sort of be that. But what practitioners, so the people who run and organize citizens' assemblies, have found is that the process actually starts much earlier. So that conversation with politicians as well as civil servants needs to happen much sooner. We need to understand what the policy cycles are, when decisions get made, so you get the timing right of your recommendations to come out, so that they can inform the discussions on the policies that are about to be decided on. And the government, of course, are, in our case, it doesn't always have to be that way. There's also assemblies that can be commissioned by civil society, but we're speaking specifically about a government commissioned one, because we want them to implement the recommendations. And what a lot of the deliberative democracy practitioners have found is that engagement needs to happen much sooner. So civil servants, you know, everyone working on it, they need to first of all understand what a citizens' assembly is. You know, famously, well, I say famously, in the democracy nerd space, was a really good one, is that Greater London Authority, so the GLA London Assembly member, asked Sadiq Khan, can we have a citizens' assembly? And Sadiq Khan's answer was, oh, what, do you want to put yourself out of a job? And it's really concerning that such a high-profile figure, actually clearly doesn't understand what a citizens' assembly is.
A lot of education to be done still.
So that outreach really needs to happen first to make politicians understand, you know, how does it work. And then you need to make sure that there is an agreement in advance, like what will happen with the recommendations. Lots of people talk about legally binding citizens' assemblies, but what we found is actually as soon as you make it legally binding, there's a whole process there to change the law that takes several years, at least 3 years. We don't have 3 years. So really what you need to do is when you have that engagement with the civil servants and the government and the politicians, is that you have an agreement that say, okay, this situation is too hard for you to decide. We're going to engage a citizens' assembly to help you out and advise you and bring these recommendations. How are we then going to implement it? How would it work? So it's for the assembly as well to understand the processes of the political system, of how policies get made into law or how policies get implemented. So there's a lot more to it than we previously thought, because a lot of assemblies have happened and they haven't been taken on, and it's because that initial groundwork hadn't been done. So that's something that we're learning as citizens' assemblies are happening all over the world. So it is that making sure that they're on board and making sure that there is an agreement of, okay, how are we going to do this? And the only way we believe that will happen is if there is public pressure for the citizens' assembly to happen. Because at the moment, you know, politicians can still say, yeah, but no one understands what a citizens' assembly is, and people don't want that. What we need is just this groundswell of energy of people saying, we want this, and we're going to put pressure on the government to put this in place. And that's also where stuff like this assembly, but also our community assemblies that we've already done all over the UK come in, because people get that taste of deliberative democracy, and they get that flavour of what it could be like if ordinary people were involved in decision making, and they come away thinking, we want more of this, and not just on a council level, you know, community assemblies, but we want a proper citizen assembly in Westminster that is going to decide bigger policies on agriculture, aviation, food systems, education, healthcare, housing, everything. These big decisions that the government needs to make, we want those decisions informed by the wishes of the people, and not just like a referendum where people are in their own little Guardian bubble or in their own little Daily Mail bubble, and just, people are stepping outside of their bubble, talking and deliberating with people that they would normally never speak to, and coming together, collaborating on solutions that would work for as many people as possible. I think fairness is absolutely key. And we're talking about people who might lose their jobs because fossil fuel jobs are gonna go away. What happens to them? You see it with the farmers in Europe at the moment. Decisions are being made about them without involving them in the conversation. They know there's climate change. They're farmers. They're fully aware. But what they're saying is the government is leaving us in the lurch. We're all going to be homeless. How am I going to feed my kids? And that is not democracy. We have to make a plan together. And that's really at the crux of it.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the lessons that have been learned and all the foundation building work that needs to be put in place first, because of course there has been some form of assembly carried out in the UK. We first made our demand when Extinction Rebellion was launched in 2018, and the government did respond with some form of assembly, didn't they?
Yeah, so I don't think it was necessarily completely due to XR, although I think we sort of upped the pressure on it. But yeah, so 6 select committees commissioned a citizens' assembly. It was called Climate Assembly UK. It was actually very exciting. David Attenborough came to speak to open it up, and lots of our group went to go and see it. It was very well run. The problem is that there was no agreement with the government. Select committees are advisory committees to Parliament. They don't have any power as such. So they can say, here's our report, read it. And that's sort of the end. They hadn't decided up front with Parliament and with the government what would then happen to with the recommendations of the Assembly. Another massive issue was because they asked XR to step in as advisors, as one of the stakeholders. They had people from Rolls-Royce and I believe Airbus as well. So they had the other side, and then they wanted some XR hippies. But we said, well, okay, but your question currently is how can we go net zero greenhouse gases by 2050?
Of course, the right question to be asking.
We're like, that is the wrong question. Are you going to allow the members of the Assembly, the randomly selected sample, are you going to allow them to deliberate on that date? And are you going to present them with information to say why that date is too late? And the answer was categorically no, because that's the government policy, and we're here to discuss the government policy. So that's when we said, okay, that is not our third demand. That just isn't good enough. But having said that, they did come up with some really amazing recommendations, even though they were obviously given the information to go by this 2050 target. A lot of them were like, well, that is clearly not soon enough. They kind of became quite radical, and it was an interesting journey. Lots of the people in that assembly weren't that bothered about climate change. And actually, the recommendations that came out of it were much more radical than we had expected, including that they wanted more deliberative democracy. Interestingly enough, some of the things they said is everyone should know this information, because they had climate scientists present to them, lots of experts. They were like, everyone should know this information. We're like, interesting. It's like they're saying, tell the truth. So they're like, yes, we agree. And they really recommended stuff on frequent flyer taxes. They all agreed no more private jets. Like, that was total no-brainer. And so they came up with lots of good things. But yeah, I mean, it was limited in its scope, and also no one knew about it. So there was absolutely no public pressure at all. The whole country should have been talking about it down the pub. Everyone should have known that this was going on, and they just didn't have the publicity. And so there was no pressure on the government to do anything with it. And as a result, they haven't.
But even given all the big weaknesses of that process, I did find it really encouraging.
Yeah.
Some of the decisions that were made out of it. So the frequent flyer levy is a really great example. This is the sort of thing that the political commentators say is not possible. We can't impose these things because they will not be popular, the public will not like them, and we will lose votes. We can't do it. And yet, and perhaps there is some truth in that, if the public is not presented with the information, they will be against things that results in a potential financial hit on their household. Yeah. But when people are not just presented with the information, but presented with the information in the absence of the disinformation, people are prepared to do what needs to be done. And that gives me a lot of hope.
We see time and time again with these assemblies, when they are given the information, people will follow the facts, they will follow the science. When they're away from that clutter of all the disinformation, as you say, they will follow the science. And at the end of the day, people will understand that this is a life or death situation, right, with climate and ecological breakdown. And people really respond to that. They have loved ones to think about. They have, they might have children or godchildren or grandchildren and concerned about their future. Many people in that assembly were very young. So it's not even other children that they're worried about, it's their own lives and the next 50, 60, 70 years that they are facing. And so you can see ordinary people are extremely brave when they are faced with those tough decisions. They know at the end of the day what is the right thing to do.
And it shows that a lot of the narratives we hear are just bullshit. They're just, it's the media and government infantilizing us. But, treat people like grown-ups and they're capable of making sensible grown-up decisions.
Absolutely. And the other thing that people say all the time is, but climate science and ecology and things like that is so complicated. The majority of people in the UK wouldn't get it. It just isn't a fact. We have yet to come across a citizens' assembly that's run, be it on abortion or housing, or in France they did one on assisted dying. In Ireland recently they did one on biodiversity loss. All complex issues, but that's up to the people who run the assembly to ensure that that information is presented in such a way that people understand it, and people can understand it. This is about their own lives. People can understand it. They get to ask questions, and it's this incredible opportunity. You get world-leading experts at your fingertips, and you can ask them questions. Assembly members are allowed to ask them to come back and explain more. They can invite other experts to say, we haven't heard enough about this. Can we have someone come explain about this? And it's amazing.
But I also don't quite believe that argument that, so yes, I agree with you, people do understand the science when it's presented, but I also don't agree that it's necessary to have a technical understanding of climate science. You just need to understand the implications. You don't need to have a technical understanding of how cancer cells split to understand what your doctor's telling you when he says that your family member has cancer. Yeah. And it's the same with climate change. People are grown up, people understand stuff, but our government does not treat us as if we're capable of making decisions.
I think it's that, and again, it comes back to that lack of real representation. One of the problems with the current political system is that there's just this huge disconnect. And even in the Labour Party, I know that, they're more normal than many of the Conservative Party members, maybe, but I think there is still that disconnect. They're career politicians. They have been, to a sense, removed from the real ordinary people on the ground who they just don't seem to trust and don't believe that they will make these good decisions. And I think the media is hugely to blame for it. If you see what people read and how they engage with it, of course you're going to think they're not capable, but it's not true.
So Marijn, I think you've done a fantastically compelling, you've made a really persuasive case, and I'm sure anyone that wasn't already sold on the idea of citizens' assemblies now will be. You've said that if we're going to make this happen, we need the concept to be out there and much bigger. We need demand from the public. And of course, that means there's a huge role for all of us, and there's a huge role for everyone watching, throughout your lives, in your family, your colleagues at work and elsewhere. Most of the people are dissatisfied with the political system we have. I can virtually guarantee that. But now you're aware of an answer that you can propose to them. So I do really, really encourage you to have those conversations. We need to get this concept out there. But beyond just speaking about it in our daily lives, how can people sat at home now contribute to making citizens' assemblies happen in this country?
So, I think knowledge and education is key. So, the conversations I think are really important. What we have started rolling out now since the big one last year, April, is community assembly. So something that we've kind of invented, although similar things have already been happening as well. So they're less rigorous processes than citizens' assemblies. They're much smaller. They can just be like a day or like here behind us, sort of a couple of hours. But it's to give people that flavor of deliberation. So I would say organize a community assembly in your community. Think of something that community members really care about. You will know where you live, what people are really concerned about. So we've had, I think, about 30 community assemblies over the past year that local groups have organised themselves all over the UK, and it's been on the health of their river with the sewage dumping at the moment. That is a huge subject. We've had them on cycle lanes, on active travel, on air pollution, on school streets, on like all sorts of local, smaller but significant issues. And they've created these community assemblies, and pretty much, well, all of them really, the people have come out of those community assemblies saying, we really like deliberative democracy, we want to see more of this. And then you tell them about our proposal of having this UK-wide one, and people are like, yeah, brilliant, let's do that. When are we doing that? And so I think that is a huge, deliberative democracy in action, I think, is a really powerful way of doing it. So if you're thinking about organising a community assembly, on the Extinction Rebellion website, there's a community assembly page. There's also more about citizens' assemblies as well. And
so we have guidance and resources.
We have guidance and resources. Yeah. We have a working group that can give you advice. We're constantly on the phone to groups in Manchester, Wales, Cornwall, all over the place that are wanting to get some advice on how to run their assemblies. And it's hugely exciting. And some of them are just running it for the sake of having that experience, but some of them are really taking their recommendations to their local councils. And like in Cornwall, what's happening is there is this direct dialogue now between community assembly members and Cornish councillors. And it's, this is something that we can start doing, sort of this groundswell. And of course, there's other organisations, the Humanity Project, Assemble. There's lots of groups who are now starting to roll out other kinds of community assemblies or POPs, or they've got different names. But that's happening all over the place now, and I think there's going to be a lot more collaboration between all of those groups as well, because I think we're all recognising that there is just this huge appetite for deliberative democracy, and people who have taken part in these processes are hungry for more. So I think that is a great step to help spread the word.
Marijn, this is so uplifting to hear. It's so exciting to hear that actually people have come up with really good solutions to the problems we face, and we just need to implement them.
Yeah.
And it's a thrill to hear that people are really, taking this tool we've been given and running with it and making things happen. So thank you so much for joining us and bringing some much needed good news onto our show. It's been fantastic. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll be back with a normal episode with Claire soon, so keep an eye out and we'll see you soon.